Ще раз доброго вечора усім.
So greetings. Once again, my name is Yuri Haidai, Senior Analyst of the Center for Economic Strategies. And we're starting our event with the overview of the draft national budget for 2023.
In the bottom panel of Zoom application, the translation is available both ways. Також для
And we can start. So despite the uncertainty of the macroeconomic situation and the fact that we have a number of parameters that do not depend on the government and those responsible for the economic policy. Of course, these are the combat operations and all these attacks against our infrastructure. Still, the government made it all possible to come up with the probable prediction, and this is really a very valuable framework in terms of the expectations and the strategy for focusing the efforts on the next year. So it's important to have a good understanding on what's inside the draft budget, what are the principles. And today, the experts of the Center for Economic Strategies will brief on the draft budget for the next year. We'll have Maria Rybko, the deputy head of the center, and then we'll have some members of the discussion that will share their points on the draft budget for the next year. So I have to tell that this is one of the activities of the draft called analytical support to evidence-based governance of the financial resources. So this project is implemented with the support of the UK Embassy. And this is done by the Center for Economic Strategies and its partners. You can leave your questions in the Q&A session or in the overall Zoom chat. There will be, of course, the streaming on Facebook. And of course, our members will pass on your questions. We'll try to mention them. So let me introduce the speakers of today's event. Maria Rybko will start with the overview. And we also have Denise Lukin, the first Deputy Minister of Finance of Ukraine. So greetings, Denise. We have Oleksandra, the expert of the Institute of Economic Researches. We'll have Anastasiia, a lawyer on the advocacy of the right to protection, and Viktor Mokseichuk, from the accounting chamber. So let me pass the floor to Maria at this time. So greetings. Thank you, Yura. From what I can understand, you're sitting in the dark and there's no electricity. I hope our streaming will continue without any delays. And we do have a number of very important speakers talking on various aspects of the budget still. I'd like to come up with the short overview of how we've seen this budget. And before the second readings, we've seen all the figures only yesterday. And so let me try to show you what changes have been made and how it looks like. So that's the war budget and how the public funding will look like in 2023. So the main specifications is that planning is something that is done a lot in terms of the assumptions, and it has to do on many spheres, including on public funding. The midterm budget planning was stopped for a certain period of time, and that was a very important part done by the Ministry of Economy. And for the time of the war, this is something that is being suspended, and the same for the budgetary laws, which goes about the maximum for budgetary expenditures, because doing some predictions and more specifically doing that at a very significant level under is something that is important, that is absolutely impossible. Also, there is the 100% probability that there will be a lot of changes to the budget. Surely these changes might be far more considerable than they are during the ordinary period of time. Then there'll be saving the money will be saved on everything except for the armed forces. Plus, there will be an inflation tax, and the significant inflation might result in the increase of the budget, but at the same time will be happening on the expenditures. That's on all the functional categories except for the defense. The donors will fund something like half of the budget expenditure. So that was brief information, and let me share with you the issues of uncertainty. Why was that such a problem? The first reading on the 13th of September, and the budget involves the increase of GDP at 4.6% and an inflation rate of 30.6%, with the nominal GDP at a level of 6.4 trillion hryvnia. Now, what happens next? The state statistics comes up with the renewed statistic for 2022 for the first and second quarter. Then they're reviewing the expectations, and we can see that on the overall, the Ukrainian economy seem to be more resistant than we were expecting to have it in the beginning of the budget cycle. The increase of the economy will be reviewed from the drop of 32.2% to 32% of GDP. Well, that's a very horrible numbers, but still it doesn't look that horrific, and it allows to increase the prediction for the nominal GDP significantly. The inflation has been reviewed, but not that considerable, from 30.1 to 29.3% of the price increase. Now, what has changed? Russia has the energy infrastructure, and these has resulted in a change of our expectation for the development of economy, because without the electricity, the intensity of the business operation will be far less significant. Besides the missile attacks that were taken into consideration in between of the first and second reading. Now, the nominated and it showed a reduction by 120 billion hryvnia. So by the second reading, we have the following specifications: the true GDP plus 3.2%, the inflation 28%, and the nominal GDP at 6.3 trillion hryvnia. Now, one more example of how significant is the uncertainty, as well as the possible changes of these predictions in 2023 and even during this year. Then we had a merit prediction on the 29th of October. I've just mentioned that. But then on the 27th of October, the National Bank of Ukraine published their own report showing an increase of the true GDP plus 4%, which is higher than the Ministry of Economy, but the inflation is 20.8%, which is far less than the inflation predicted by the Ministry of Economy. The nominal GDP is not that significant in terms of difference, but the National Bank of Ukraine believes that it will be 100 billion hryvnia less than expected by the Ministry of Economy. So now there's very experienced teams of the macroeconomic experts. They have discrepancies towards their views of the further economy. So we'll need to prepare for the changes, and we'll see how it goes. It all depends on the frontline operations there. All the available resources are currently dedicated to the military operations. Should we take a look at the history of the budget of 2022, you will see that the defense has become the largest user of the state funds, so that every spare hryvnia was spent on that. And the rest budgetary expenditures were also at a minimum possible level, and considering the inflation, a fairly significant one, they've truly reduced because of the de-evaluation of hryvnia. That was really reduction, and the amount spent on social benefits, on education and medical supplies, in fact, reduced. We've still increased the expenditures on the defense, on law enforcement. They will stay the same next year. The government has the prediction that the war would continue, and unfortunately this will stay for long with us. The expenditures of the budget would be 2.6 trillion, and 43% of them would be on security and defense. And of course, on its own, considerable the drop of the economy and the export drops, as well as the tax drops, the country would not be able to fund the rest of the expenditures, because the income we get is only 200 million higher than the expenditures on the defense. So the rest will be covered by the donors. The deficit, 1.3 trillion, that's 21% of the GDP. That's unprecedented for Ukraine, because the previous fiscal policy was very balanced. And now this situation requires a significant budget deficit. Then we need to repay the debts, not the external ones, since Ukraine agreed on the standstill, but there's the GDP. That part of that is covered by the national and private bank, and we would need to cover those debts. So the overall need in funding, so in addition to the deficit, we still need to find some money. So the overall need is 1.7 trillion. That's 41 billion USD, or 27% of the GDP. So this will be covered through the external loans, and part of those loans, we don't know which part, that will be provided in the form of grants and not in the form of loans. Because if Ukraine will be loaning that much money, then the economic stability on the long-term perspective would be far worse. The overall need in funding from foreign sources or from external sources, that's 38 billion USD. This is the amount mentioned by Mr. Marchenko, the Minister of Finance, in his talks to foreign partners. But as I've showed you on this graph, these are the expenditures on social support, medicine, and education. They're very low, and this 38 billion USD, that for Ukraine, this will not be enough even to make the minimum reconstruction of what has been destroyed. In order to restore the roofs, in order to restore the energy infrastructure after missile hit. So Ukraine would need more money on this immediate recovery, in this fast track recovery. And this will need to be coordinated with the donors. So this concludes my brief presentation. Maybe my colleagues would share more detailed information on some of other aspects of the National Budget 2023. So let me say thank you for listening, and I'm stopping sharing my screen. Yura, please. So Maria, thank you very much for this briefing, for the overview, for some of the aspects that you've underlined, more specifically that this budget was compiled under so significant uncertainty. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to the first Deputy Minister of Finance. So Denis, please share some of your thoughts on this budget and the most significant challenges in terms of implementing this budget. So please, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Maria, for this overview of the budget. And let me start by saying that not everything is that difficult in planning and budgeting, because over the past 8 months, we've did a lot of very important steps. And back in February, we started with planning for 1 hour, and now we are planning for a year. So that's a fairly significant step forward. Now, talking about the differences or discrepancies in terms of our main experts in prediction of the macroeconomic, don't believe these are very significant discrepancies, because this discrepancy in terms of the nominal GDP, there's a slight difference in terms of the value GDP as well as the inflation. I wouldn't say they're very significant. And there's different assumptions being taken into consideration while doing the predictions on the main components of the macroeconomic situation. And the Ministry of Finance, while doing the budgetary planning back in August, and now, let's say we do have a different picture, because back in August, we had more pessimistic predictions, but today, after 2 months, we understand that the situation is changing for the better. Thanks to the armed forces of Ukraine, we have far more confidence if compared with August. And that is why we do have a different picture in terms of what we can do for the next year. Budget is more, so to say, careful in terms of that. We're not making any adjustments on social expenditures, as well as the adjustments of the base guaranteed salary or the minimum amount per month for living. We are leaving these aspects as they are now. There's no changes in this minimum figures, and still there will be an impact on the budgetary period next year. And having talked to colleagues and having discussed all the indicators, we've increased the expenditures of the pensionary fund in order to make sure we balance the indexation. Besides, we've made some adjustments on some other expenditures for certain categories. Then we've also reviewed some of the subcategories, and you'll be able to see that we've specified the value-added tax, we've specified the income tax, we've changed some of the predictions on the tax for the income of physical persons. We've changed the rent payments due to the change of the tax code, and then we've also reviewed the excise tax, considering the changes that were already happening in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, and therefore we've had a reduction of incomes over the general fund of the state budget, and then there is a slight increase in the income of the social fund. Now, speaking of our expectations, we understand that the next year is something that will be spending under condition of the martial law. So that was the assumption of the Ministry of Finance. That is why the priority expenditures that should be covered by the internal market, that would be the expenditures covering the security and defense sector expenditures. Now, these are the expenditures not covered by our foreign partners, because they are not able to fund this according to their documents. So in order to cover the expenditures of the security and defense sector, we have to mobilize the internal market. That's in terms of the incomes and in terms of the loans. As for the non-military expenditures, This is something where we are using the support of our foreign partners. We have the World Bank project called PEACE, the microfinancial support coming from the EC. And we're also using the funds we are receiving from our foreign partners. We had 2.6, 2.8 billion. There was 2 tranches for that amount of money. So this is how it happens. Now, 77% of non-defense related expenditures are funded by our foreign partners. And the main task for us is to negotiate with the foreign partners in order to still have the sufficient resources for the next year, and in order to cover the priority non-defense related expenditures through the funds granted by the foreign partners. So of course, we're working with them in order to make sure that this would be a grant-related money, but not all the money are being transferred to Ukraine as grants. And those who are provided as loans, they're provided on beneficial conditions, fairly beneficial one, I would say, with the grace period of 4 to 6 years. So on the long-term perspective, we would be able to work with that. So that's not going to be a very significant challenge in the years to come. Now, as for the recovery, the budget has a mechanism for fast track recovery that's dealing with the key infrastructure facilities. That we have a fund special for elimination of the consequences. We're talking about something like 35 billion hryvnia. Besides, there's this reserve fund in the budget to cover the expenditures that we cannot predict. That's in order to cover some of the important fundamental aspects. So that's a brief overview on the next year budget. I'm not going to take any more of your time. If you have any questions, I'm ready to debate them. Thank you, Denise, and calling upon all the participants and to ask questions. There's 100 participants in Zoom. And Denise, I'd like to make a question. We can see that one of the changes for the second reading is that the income from the import VAT, which is one of the largest sources of incomes, has increased, and the value-added tax for the national produced goods has decreased by 6.2 billion hryvnia. Now, how would you explain that? Look, speaking about the imported VAT, everything is fairly simple. Before, in between of the first and second reading, there was a change in the tax code, and we've introduced or returned, in fact, to the rates that we had before the beginning of the large-scale war. So that's in terms of the tax over the fuel. And in that case, there will be an increase in the tax rates. And we've calculated that, and we had 27 billion hryvnia. Now, speaking of the internal VAT, that's minus 6 billion. That we've considered the renewed estimation on the indicators, and so this is where you would have this minus 6 billion. Thank you. Any other questions? As we do have a question from Zhenya Luber, please, you have a chance to ask this question. Zhenya? Well, I believe we have a technical problem. So, Denise, I have another question for you. Which articles or which sources for the income could be facing the most significant threats and challenges? Well, as I've said, the most modest assumptions for the next year, this is something we've done. So hopefully what we predict, this is what is going to happen. And there's not too many factors. In fact, only one factor that has not been changing since the 24th of February. It changes only its behavior. So based on these behavior, we'll be adjusting any of the indicators, but I don't see any risks that will be failing to somehow implement or accomplish what we've planned. I do apologize, and thank you, Denise. If there are any other questions from the participants of our mission, there is a question in the Q&A session, and let me mention this question. Oleksandra is asking whether the program for the development of industrial parks for 2023, whether it will be funded. Yesterday was a resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers on the compensation of these industrial parks for the amount of 60 million hryvnia, but whether there will be money for that. Well, in the version that we've submitted, and that was done yesterday, there were no industrial parks. So the Ministry of Finance is, was not considering this issue, but for the sake of development of the businesses, there is a budget on grant support from the Ministry of Economy. There is over 1 billion hryvnia, and then the program for the compensation of the insurance rates. That's in accordance the program for the development of the businesses. That's something like 16 billion. Now, these were the projects that worked successfully in the previous year. They gave some results in synergy with the program for the portfolio guarantees on that business. So there's portfolio guarantees provided for the next year. So hopefully these three mechanisms will offer the significant support to our businesses so that those indicators mentioned in the budget as incomes would be accomplished. And a question from Susan Stewart. Is it already clear which international actors are willing to provide grants and which one insist on loans? Well, it's not that someone would insist on loans. It's that in accordance to the Constitution, they can provide something, because, for example, macro-financial support cannot be provided in form of grants. Some of the countries are providing us support bilaterally. In some cases, they just simply cannot provide us with some of the funding through loans or through grants. This peace project, for example, it will be provided in the form of grants to Ukraine. That's more specifically coming from the United States, and they've confirmed that they will be ready to provide grant support next year. Macrofinance support that will be provided next year, well, surely that would be provided based on the conditions that would be established next year. And I've just finished recording the podcast with the director of EBRD in Ukraine, and he mentioned that EBRD tried to review their approach very fast, because of course you cannot have the standard approach towards Ukraine following the very same standards with regards to the investments, with regards to funding, but still EBRD is limited by its own charter. So please listen to that recording. So Dennis, thank you very much for your answers, and we'll move on. We'll have a conversation now on the needs of the IDPs and whether they're covered in the draft budget and any other major challenges available and how the state is planning to solve this. So I'd like to pass the floor to Anastasiia Brown. So please, Anastasiia, you have the floor. Thank you. And from the standpoint of the ADP and on behalf of our organization dealing with the protection of their rights, we'd like to make an overview of the programs provided in the draft state budget. So I would like to share my screen. And hopefully you'll be able to hear this. And speaking about the programs that are already provided in the national budget. So let's start with housing programs. First is the beneficial possibility for loans. That's for the participants of the ATO, as well as the appropriation of the joint forces for the procurement of housing. Currently, the draft budget has an amount of 16,800,000 hryvnia. And I would like to underline that that program existed in the budgets of 2021 and 2022. So when we're talking about the next year, we have to underline that this program is in Annex 4, a special budget, a special fund of the budget. And should we review this program has to be funded by paying the interest over the previous loans and the return of the loans that were issued from the national budget to cover this the same goals previously. And we have to mention that over the period of the martial law period, the legislation of Ukraine provides certain sort of delays and in some cases allows the loaners not to pay the penalties for untimely performance of their payments. Anastasiia, please do not speak so fast. I will try to speak a bit slowly. So returning to this program, I would like to underline that the legislation of Ukraine currently sets some limitations in terms of returning loans and the payment of penalties for the untimely repayment. And in fact, the resolution number 970 of 2019, which regulates the procedure for offering such loans, in accordance to the most recent amendments, it provides for the possibility to delay the repayment of loans in case, for example, if the housing that was procured with this loan was damaged or destroyed. That is why, if we're talking about the funding of the next loans at the account of repayment of the previous loans and for the payment of penalties for the untimely performance of these commitments, then we have some questions. The next program is providing the beneficial loans to IDPs. The second reading has the amount increased, and we're talking about 79 million hryvnia, and the draft version for the first reading offered only 59 million. Now, In this case, we do have some concerns with regards to the sources of funding for these loans, just as we have some questions to such source of money for that's the penalty for untimely payment on the interests or the repayment of the loans. Speaking on the other projects, it covers the several subventions for the payment of the compensation. As you can see, the amounts are fairly significant. They were also provided for in the previous years and in the law on the national budget of Ukraine for 2022. Now, if we go to the next slide, you will see one more subvention program and the amount it covers for 2023 under this program. But talking about the use of these funds in 2023, now all the money under these programs were redistributed to the reserve fund of the national budget and in accordance to the provisions of the budget code. The government was provided with authorities to take decisions on the reduction of expenditures and the crediting of the national budget to be further allocated to the general fund and further used for the needs of the armed forces. So that took place in this year, and we'll see what's going to happen next year with the funds and how the money would be distributed, whether they will be allocated to cover the subvention or there will be a redistribution like that. Now, talking about the programs provided under the draft budget for 2023, that's the subvention from the national budget to the local budget on the implementation of projects under the frames of the recovery program of Ukraine. And it provides for the use of funds to restore and recover the social and housing infrastructure. We're talking about the territory under control of the Ukrainian government in order to overcome the consequences of Russian aggression. There's certain limitations with regards to the regions that might be using this subvention, that's controlled areas of Donetsk and Lugansk region that suffered from the conflict of four regions, Kharkivska, Dnipropetrovska, Khersonska, and Zaporizhzhia, the social services and the infrastructure, which is significantly affected due to the inflow of the IDPs and certain local councils that are hosting a significant influx of the IDPs. Now, the information on this program is posted on the website of the Ministry of the Development of Communities. Now, in addition to this subvention, there's another one that may be used for recovery and reconstruction. That's the subvention from the national budget to the local budget on the implementation of projects for the recovery of Ukraine. Now, the directions that the funding could be provided for, that includes the emergent repairs and energy efficiency measures, the infrastructure for the offering housing to IDPs, the repairs in schools, medical centers, and more information on this program could be found on the website of the Ministry of Development of Communities. Now, should we take a look at the other programs, as we've already, there's this fund to eliminate the consequences of armed aggression. Yesterday, there were some changes and the expenditures for these funds were significantly increased. Earlier, we were talking about 9 billion. Currently, there's 35 billion in the national budget. And the establishment of this fund for 2023, it's provided by one of the articles, the law on the national budget. Now, where this money could be spent on the construction of the public housing shelters, the reconstruction and overhaul repair of the critical infrastructure, That's on water supply, water distribution, heat supply, heat distribution, and the other thing, that's the new construction and reconstruction and major overhaul, as well as designing the documents for the construction of buildings for IDPs and those people whose houses were damaged or destroyed by the Russian Federation attack. Now, what's so interesting about this fund? Now, in order for the fund to be funded properly, there was a law 8027 that should be approved that allowed for the changes to the law of Ukraine. Now that law has been passed, so the president of Ukraine has to sign that. Now, as for the other programs, and what raises some of the concerns among our organization from the standpoint of the production of IDPs is that it does not provide for the program on the subvention to local budgets for supporting the territories affected by the conflict in the east of Ukraine. Earlier, this subvention was used for the construction and the repair of the housing, including social facilities, to provide some of the accommodations into the to be used for procuring wood, for reimbursing damages, or reimbursement that calls for the transportation of the wood. And that's something that is very topical this winter. That could be topical also in the beginning of 2023. But we can't see this program in the draft national budget for 23. And what else? There's this lack of a separate program. Earlier, it was the monetary compensation to those people who had their houses damaged or destroyed by Russian Federation's aggression or attack. There's no separate program. We understand that there's a new mechanism being elaborated for such a compensation, and hopefully there will draft law 7998 would set this mechanism. At the same, so far we can't see any money for the payment of such compensations. And in the end, I'd like to have a few words on social aspect, just 1 minute left. So we can't see also the program for monthly support to RDPs to cover the accommodation costs and to, utility expenditures. That was a very important program that worked this year. And considering the first draft of these law, there was an explanatory note saying that this money will be provided in the other programs, like supporting the persons in difficult living conditions. But considering the explanatory note to the second draft for the second reading, unfortunately, we have concerns, we have doubts as to how those money would be used and whether there will be sufficient funding to support the IDPs and whether it will be provided with social benefit and social support. So thank you. Anastasiia, thank you very much. Now, before passing the floor to Viktor Nazarchuk, I'd like to, to mention one of the questions from one of the speakers. So could you explain the upside and downside risks to the budget deficit estimate? For example, does the budget include provisions for gas purchases and rapid recovery for survival expenditure? And There are other risks, for example, the asset quality review for the banking sector that is being undertaken. Any risks with the problems of the assets of the banking sector. Now, in my understanding, are there any risks of capitalization or other risks or the threats of further increasing the deficit? Thank you. That's an interesting question. We do predict the fiscal risks every year, and we submit that with the draft law on the national budget. So, as for the gas sales or gas procurements, we don't have a separate budget program for this. In any case, we're trying to work together with our foreign partners in order not to increase the budget deficit. And these financial resources, they could be sent directly to the NACO for gas procurements under certain protection, or that could be the guarantee of the Ministry of Finance, or there could be other mechanisms. Or we could be receiving those resources in the form of grants, but at the moment of our submitting this draft, we didn't have those resources, but working with NACO Naftogaz of Ukraine, we've had some specifications on the needs of the imported gas that Naftogaz needs. Now, speaking on the RDNA and the recovery, I have to say that in the budget of Ukraine, we have a separate article that would allow us, using the budgetary mechanisms and principles, in case of having those money transmitted or on the recovery, not on the elimination of consequences, but on the recovery, when the martial law will be over or cancelled, and when we'll start the recovery and not the elimination of consequences. There is a budgetary mechanisms that would allow to use these funds. If I'm not mistaken, that's Article 33 in the draft law submitted for the consideration of the Verkhovna Rada. Thank you, Denise. And I believe that is the answer to the question by Susan Stewart, who asked also, do the speaker see connections between the National Recovery Plan presented in Lugano and the draft budget and the needs and projects mentioned in the plan reflected in the budget? So currently, this could be only provided by the partners, unless we're talking about the emergent expenditures. So Denise, thank you for your answers. And let me pass the floor to Victor Mozarchuk from the accounting chamber, and he will provide us more details on the income and expenditure parts of the budget, debit and credit, so to say. So good afternoon. So we still have 10 minutes. Well, we can have an additional 5 or 7 minutes. So I'll try to be very much focused. Maria told a lot, Denis Valerievich told a lot, and Anastasiia covered some of the social aspects. So I'll start from the end. More specifically, I'd like to express words of gratitude to the team of the Ministers of Finance. And there's this request, can you give more figures in these estimates and the predictions? So we are reading this document. Thank you. And it helps a lot to the accounting chamber also to understand the overall logics of the government while drafting the national budget. So very briefly, I'd like to mention some of the Maria's statement that this budget is unique, and we've never had any budgets like that before, because there is a significant uncertainty. We don't have midterm budgetary planning, and it was right, and that they was supported, and also, unfortunately, the budget users have a very short period of time for making budget requests, and maybe that would have an impact on the quality of the documents, but still, there is an interesting story, and I'm glad that it was not implemented. That is the special procedure for approval of the national budget within 1 day. And as a person standing for the rules and procedures, I think that was wrong. And it's great that the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine has elaborated this document and supported that. The budget spam has been reduced, and if not for many of for some of the MPs, that would be really a unique budget. And we had less than 500 proposals. That's the fastest budget we've ever approved in the first reading. And I wish all of us and the team of the Ministry of Finance as the budget that will be approved in the modern history of Ukraine. Now, let's have more conversation about risks, the incomes and expenditures. Speaking about the incomes, as you know, the accounting chamber is analyzing the draft budget and provides its own conclusions. And there's some peculiarities at this point. I'd like to focus your attention on this high risk of some of the taxes, and this is something that was mentioned before, but I believe there won't be a significant increase due to the reduction of the average because there will be not that many taxpayers coming from side migration. Then there's the question on the national bank. There's a very interesting approach used by the Ministry of Finance, that plus 52 billion over the general special fund and plus 35 billion on the general fund. I believe that was a reserve from the very beginning that the Ministry of Finance had for the second reading. But any tools are perfect as long as they're effective. Now, speaking about the funding incomes, the lack of grants, and Dennis has mentioned that there will be some, but since there are no clear agreements, we can't have it written, but I believe there will be a replacement of loans to grants, and we hope the Ministry of Finance would be successful in that, because we'll be repaying less in that case. And this is something we'll need to repay next year, particularly plus 160 billion, because the Ministry of Finance has to fund the expenditures on the security and defense sector. And also, if you have a chance, then please pay the security, please buy the military securities. So let us ensure the funding of the salaries to our soldiers, to those people who are protecting Ukraine and defending it against, well, we're on the air, so I can't give the right name to the Russians. And tomorrow, there will be a repayment of the securities, so those who get them will be able to buy more securities. Now, on expenditures, There's plus 67 billion. That's if compared to the first reading. The pension fund, I think that was a right decision to increase that, but whether there will be enough money, since there will be an indexation in the March, and we would need to take a look, because the most recent trends of this month, the payment of pensions in the last 4 days were done based on the loans, but the overall trend is making sure we would need to focus our attention on that. The elimination, the fund for the elimination of the consequences, that's something we had, but I'm not sure whether we'll get 35 billion for that next year. Hopefully we will have that. Now, what we have to praise for, from the standpoint of Ministry of Social Policy, they are fulfilling this strategies for public funding, and they've gathered as much as possible the budgetary programs, though they had diversified, they've combined them, and the minister has violated the Article 28 of the budgetary code and did not submit the budgetary requests, and hopefully that was the final time. And we didn't like the story with the Ministry of Social Policy, the fact that they've agreed to some of the political proposals of certain MPs, and they've diversified their budgetary programs, and that's not the right approach. So more explanations and needed in that case. And the last, but not the least for sure, let me just mention this. I know that the Ministry of Finance is monitoring this indicator, but still, that's the social expenditures. According to my calculations, in May, you would need to introduce changes into the budget if there will be if there won't be a large redistribution. So please monitor this. Do not overburden, let's say, the processes. But on the overall, speaking on the budget, I liked it, except for certain aspects. If there'll be any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I'm not going to take any more of your time. So thank you. Thank you, Victor. We do have a question, but I'll address them later on. There's one more express question, small question to Denise, while we'll still have a chance to that. Konstantin Hlechuk, if I pronounce that correctly, is asking, no, Ihor Olehov, whether there is a risk of the conversion of or the lack of foreign. So is there a risk of converting foreign currency domestic government bonds into hryvnia bonds in case of negative developments in budget execution or lack of external revenues? So the short answer is no. We're the best source of saving our funds. So welcome. There's the website of Bong.gov.ua. This is the site where you can buy the military bonds. So thank you. Now in this case, let me pass the floor to Oleksandra Betliy. So Oleksandra, thank you for finding the time to connect, to join us. So please tell us this topic that we've already covered. Now, who's providing us the money? And should we expect a stable funding with the support of our foreign partners? And it was something that Serhiy Marchenko underlined in his most recent meetings abroad. So what would be the sources of the money? Who will be provided this money, and risks? So greetings, everyone. So let's take a look at what's being predicted for the next year. 20% of the GDP that would be covered by the foreign partners, but it might be less than planned because part of the money will be receiving in the form of grants. So 40% of the money were provided as grants. So therefore the deficit would be lower. But then there's this key question, what would be the sources of money? And on this graph, you could see the figures provided by the government for the first reading. Most of the funding we were expected to receive from the IMF, then from the United States and other countries, part of that from the EU. And the major risk for the next year's funding is that from what we see in the statements by the IMF and Madame Georgieva, they're not ready to provide us with the major program. So the IMF is not having the mechanisms or the tools to support the countries having challenges like we do. So the country who's doing the right fiscal policy and the monetary policy is now facing crisis because we're under attack by the terrorist country. And therefore we're having the challenges that we have. So we, together with the other partners, we've wrote a request to the IMF suggesting to start a new policy for supporting countries like Ukraine. But it seems like the IMF is not ready to implement the mechanisms. Instead, we were offered with a new mechanism of support, a program which is monitored by the board, program of monitoring of board involvement. And the idea of the program is that the experts and the board members from the IMF, they are preparing the macro financial frames, they're preparing the policies that we would need to implement as the country, and then the other countries will be offering money for that program. But it's more for the recovery, but rather than emergency funding. At the same time, last week, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, has underlined that it started a dialogue with the EU members so that the EU would be allocating Ukraine 1.5 billion euro on a monthly basis to cover our needs. Why is that important? Today, we are receiving support from various international partners, as you can see that on this on this slide. And this Ministry of Finance is preparing this slide, and we are very grateful for that. But the support is coming in an unstable and unpredicted manner. So if the EU will take a decision that 1.5 billion would be allocated on a monthly basis, unfortunately, we do have some troubles with the connection. So the largest amount of support, talking about the foreign partners, is provided by the US. They're providing us on a timely basis, and this is provided in the form of grants. And there was a question in the Q&A as to the preconditions for providing the support. Well, the US has this standing agreement that as long as this money are being paid, there could be used for social benefits, for salaries, for medical, also supplies, which are also underlined as priorities for by the government in order to support the population. Now, talking about the European Union, in June, they have approved the program for the micro financial support. In August, we've received 1 billion, and just recently we've received additional 2 billion. This is fairly slow. And this support is provided in the form of loans. As the first deputy said, these are the beneficial loans. There is a significant grace period. We are not going to repay for a significant amount of money, for a significant amount of period of this money. But still, this is a loan. And but it's very important to have the grace period that would allow the country to recover and start repaying. Now, the other important disadvantage is the lack of predictability and the support. And as you can see, the first line, there's the National Bank of Ukraine, is the major donor or the source of funding for our budget. This is the military bonds, and significant amount of money was produced out of that in June. Then the second table by the Ministry of Finance, and it shows that there's this promise of 36 to 37 billion US dollars. We've currently received 24 because we've received some of the money from the World Bank last year, and we've received 65% of what we were supposed to receive. And that raises some questions in terms of the funding of the planned expenditures. And next year, we will need to receive 38 billion. That's only to cover the what's predicted in the budget. And the budget has only partial considered this 17 billion US dollars. That's what we need to cover the emergent. That's everything. That's everyone keep talking about this, but still, there's 2 billion from EBRD. There's several billions from local budget. There's funds for the liquidation of consequences, but we need 17 billion US dollars. That's for the emergency recovery. So I'd like to, of course, express words of gratitude to the Ministry of Finance and to the government for the fact that since the beginning of this conflict, they started from the beginning of the war, they started contacting with our partners on terms of support, but still our partners are slow and irregular in terms of this support. And that was the presentation that I have for you. So Oleksandra, thank you for such an overview. And we still have several minutes in order to address some of the questions. And let me ask our speakers if you want to summarize anything just for a couple of minutes, if you want to introduce a bottom line for a statement, so please do so. Let me start. So it's not going to be a bottom line, but another very important issue, which is a very emergent one. The point is that the lack of expenditures on the emergent reconstruction, particularly the energy infrastructure, which is very important for the businesses to keep working, that will result in the reduction of the economic activity of the business and the reduction of taxes that the business will be able to pay. That will have an impact on the ability to fund the military expenditures, which can be funded only from the internal sources. So it's important to work with donors so that next year they will be able to fund not only the 38 billion, this is something that we need to cover the basic minimum budgetary expenditures, but to start finally talking about the reconstruction now and not the post-war reconstruction as it was in Berlin's conference, or like talking about reconstruction somewhere. That's good, but we need to move faster. And I believe that Ministry of Finance is doing tremendous work in conversation with multiple donors. That's wonderful. And we do need the support of everyone in this matter. Thank you. Yes, you've raised a very important aspect. There is very critical expenditures. and that will multiply the expenditures later on and will generate the losses of the economy. So Dennis, please, you have the floor. Thank you. Let me tell you that we do have some money on rapid sort of recovery. We'll be using our own resources primarily. There's some money on critical infrastructure, including on energy, heat, the recovery of basic needs on deoccupied territories, the recovery of energy consumption will be either a direct expenditures or on the account of donors from EBRD, reprofiling their loans. This is everything that's been done. I was talking about the reconstruction. Now, the reconstruction, that's going to be later on. Now it's elimination of consequences. What you've mentioned, that's going to be the elimination of consequences. That's definite, and there's money provided for that. A minimum, what we have is something around 45 billion hryvnia. That's direct expenditures, and we're also talking to EBRD, and he's ready to change some of these policies. There are projects that we started till the 24th of February. We can change them to use the money for recovery. It's just that it's not the Ministry of Finance who's the major user of the funds, but we are leading the process actively. So I think in that part, we are absolutely fine. The rest and the donors could be well understood. They are having this concerns about giving money to the facilities that could be destroyed on the very next day. So that's reconstruction. That has to be after our victory. There is one more question, if I can do that. I'll try to rephrase what was mentioned. Are you expecting that next year the state will have more sort of debts in terms of the VAT repayment? Well, we're trying to repay everything. It's just that due to the reduction of the economic activity before the export, the requests have dropped. So we're trying to fulfill all the commitments to the business. And this gives the chance for the business to work. Thank you. I'll give you the floor to sum up some vendors this question: why the accounting chamber is analyzing the budget? Don't you have a conflict of interest since you're also verifying the implementation of the budget? Look, let me try to give you a philosophic answer. Sometimes it's better not to have any partners rather than have like strange partners who, instead of supporting, causing harms. Whether we have a conflict, there is no conflict. Why the accounting chamber has to do the budget analysis? Because it's provided by the law. Because there's this great need in parliamentarians to understand the budget. That's briefly, but should we dig deeper? And by analyzing by identifying the risks, including through the methodology for the analysis of the budget, which unfortunately is something that we still not having provided, we have a better chance to analyze and to work. Now, speaking about the summaries, first of all, I'd like to express words of gratitude to the team of the Ministry of Finance, which is fairly strange. You can't, that's a surprise to hear that from me. And I understand how difficult was the work that's been done. Secondly, I would really like to have the budget of 2023 would not only be the most unexpected and uncertain, but still it would be the most effective in terms of its use, including the money coming from the state budget that the taxpayers' money and from the donors that we are receiving from the EU, and we are absolutely grateful for them, to them, and from the US taxpayers and all the civilized countries, so that they would be used effectively. And I keep saying that if these are the foreign funds, so I keep offering that if this foreign money would be used inefficiently, so let those officials who fail to use them inefficiently, let they take responsibility in accordance to legislation of those foreign countries. Thank you. Everyone just have 30 seconds, no more. So just wanted to underline one aspect, which is very important. That's openness and transparency. So in the budget, there's a large share of money that's a fund for the elimination of consequences and subvention to the local budget, which is a reserve fund. It's a big money for recovery and reconstruction, and it would be good from the standpoint of an expert. And we talked to bonders, they also underline the importance of that, to see the principles and priorities and how those money would be allocated and how they will be spent, to make sure it's transparent, it's understandable, and it's important for the donors, because all the donors are underlining the transparency, understandability, and the trust. It's important for them that the money are being spent transparently. And that's something as a prerequisite for further support to Ukraine, so that they would be explaining their own taxpayers why they're providing support to Ukraine. So I'd really like to have this transparency, even at this stage of fast track recovery. Because later on, we'll be talking talking about the recovery and new construction as the members of Rise Coalition. We stand for this transparency in order to make sure that we understand where the money coming from, where they've been spent. And I think that's important for the government and for the experts doing the monitoring. And what's even more important, that's important for the donors. Fortunately, I have to leave you. Thank you, Oleksandra. Now, Anastasia, just a couple of words, no more. The Prime Minister has underlined that this budget has to be a budget for the victory, whether it will be a budget of support, protection, and resolution of the housing issue. That's still questionable, but hopefully that at least part of this problem would be resolved thanks to the programs provided in that. Thank you. Thank you, Anastasia. Now we've ran out of time, so I'd like to express words of gratitude to all the participants of our discussion. Thank you. I'd like to thank Dennis for finding so many time in his agenda and his schedule. And thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to those who asked their questions and those who registered for our event. They will receive all the materials in digital copy. Yeah, they will receive the presentation and the analysis. So that's a bonus for those who registered for our event. So thank you. Stay safe. Thank you.